What has inspired you to defend reason like this? Is it the political events taking place around the world?
It's the political events. It is the fact that so many of our disagreements and debates aren't driven by data, but by pulling prefabricated opinions off the shelf instead of treating society like an ongoing experiment where we should see what works and what doesn't, taking a scientific mindset to questions about politics, and interpreting the time course of history. I have tried to answer questions such as, is the world getting better or worse, not by how it feels, not by anecdotes and headlines, but by plotting data over time and seeing which way the trends go.
So when one looks at the data in your book, and there's a lot of data, it invariably points to the fact that things are getting better, on just about every metric. And yet, a lot of people don't believe you. They don't believe the data. So what's that all about?
More often they're not aware of the data. More often they get their opinion from headlines, which are a misleading way of ascertaining the state of the world, because as long as something goes wrong, it's news. Often the things that go right aren't news. They consist of a country that's at peace, or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists, or longevity increasing a bit every year, or poverty going down bit by bit every year. There's never a Thursday in October in which they make the news. On the other hand, you can always generate a lot of damage in a hurry. If you're a terrorist, if you're a rampage shooter, that is guaranteed to attract headlines. Because the human mind assesses risk and danger and probability by images, by narratives, by anecdotes, which are fed by the news, we can come away with a systematically misleading impression of which way the world is going if it's based on news.
You're a psychologist, amongst many other things, but isn't that the problem, that we're not that interested in things going well for us? We just end up taking them for granted, and therein lies the problem.
That's true. We find new things to get upset about when we've solved one problem, and that can create the illusion that things are getting worse, whereas it could just mean that our standards are rising. And it is a feature of human nature that we dread losses more than we savor gains.
So you're trying to reverse that by reminding people of the gains.
That's right, and the gains often creep up on us by stealth. Often you have to be reminded of the fact, for example, that there are no more fascist dictatorships in Western Europe, that Southeast Asia is not fighting a war, that the rate of extreme poverty has been plummeting by hundreds of thousands of people every week, but never a point at which it makes the news.
But I can store those facts away, and then I can focus again on the fly that's bothering me in the room, or whatever upset me on the commute that morning. I mean, isn't that the problem with the good news, is that the good news is accepted very quickly and then it's just put away?
That is a problem, and it's a problem not just in terms of sheer accuracy, but in terms of people's conviction as to whether problems are solvable. If you believe that things are spiraling downward no matter what we do, all of the attempts to bring peace to the world, to increase prosperity, to increase fairness and justice have failed, you might think, well, it's a waste of time. Let's just sit back and enjoy our lives. Or you could become radical and think that our current institutions are failing so badly that they should just be torn down, and anything that rises out of the rubble is bound to be better than what we have now.
President Trump, when he became president, described an incredibly bleak and gloomy view of America, carnage on the streets of America. If I read him or his supporters the data in your book, they would probably just say, well, that's not our story. That's not our experience. That is not what our gut is telling us.
Yes,
that's very hard to argue against, isn't it?
Yeah, well, other than saying your gut is wrong, and that since the gut feelings of the people you disagree with are wrong, we've got to see who's right, who's wrong by looking at the facts.
But how is it possible to make that argument to Trump supporters or supporters of Brexit without sounding like an elitist professor?
Well, by appealing to the fact that no one wants to be wrong. No one wants to be full of baloney. I don't take my goal as one of widespread political messaging. I'm not a political consultant. I'm trying to convince people who do care about evidence and data and fact. And that's still a lot of people.
it's still a lot of people, and yet it is the other side, it is the dark narrative that seems to be defining politics at the moment.
Sometimes.
Not always, no. But
not always.
But in some crucial places, like, for instance, Washington, D.C.
In Washington, D.C., although that's not always true. There were a lot of quirks and shenanigans to the 2016 election. We did have, before this dystopian current president, the president of Hope and Change, who was elected twice. We've had Bill Clinton, who had an optimistic message. On the right, Ronald Reagan was a successful American president with a message that it's morning in America. So dystopianism is one political tactic. It's one rhetorical trope, but it's not the only one that's effective.
And do you think the dystopianism of today, whether it's Trump or some people might say Brexit in this country, or the alternative for Germany, in Germany, the national rally in France, do you think that very dark view of reality is the child of the Great Recession? Is it the fact that we've taken too much success, too much for granted for too long? What's the reason?
I think both of those, but it's also part of the systematic distortion that comes from the news. The worst things that happen are always highlighted. The gradual trends are not, which creates an opening for entrepreneurs of mayhem to attract the attention of the news by making people feel unsafe through terrorist attacks or through rampage shootings or through angry, divisive tweets. The system can be gamed by clever people who know how to attract saturation coverage and can tilt the view of the world to this dystopian nightmare.
So what would your headlines look like? Another great day for beating malaria, or
I think that
influenza wiped out for the season?
I think that it wouldn't be bad if those got more coverage, if there was more comparison of the present to the recent past, if there was more data.
But it begins to read like Pravda, doesn't it, or the North Korean Daily? Too much good news on the front page makes people suspicious.
I know that that's a belief among journalists, but it's not true. If the goal of journalism is to give people an accurate picture of the world, it can't just be to present the negative and to fear that every time we talk about something succeeding, we're Pravda. That, I think, is a pathology of journalism that journalists should get over. The goal isn't to make people feel better. The goal isn't to elevate moods, obviously. The goal is to present an accurate picture of reality. And if the mindset is only bad news is serious journalism, that's going to lead to an inaccurate picture of reality.
You're that rarest of things. You are a purveyor of good news, and you would say, obviously, good facts as well that underpin the good news. How come so many people, looking at the papers, seem to really hate what you say?
It's a lot of people really like what I say. I know. And I don't consider myself a purveyor of good news.
You've got some very strong critics out there, who are really upset by the fact that you're purveying good news.
Yes. Well, for one thing, the entire mindset that we should assess the world through data is not universally appreciated. There are many people who run by stories, by narratives, by anecdotes, both in journalism and in academia. So it's asking people to take a more data-oriented, empirical, scientific mindset. There are also a certain number of intellectuals who set themselves up as critics, attackers of society, of institutions. They see the role of intellectuals to always try to tear down the status quo. And to hear that actually extreme poverty has been going down, rates of death in war have been going down, levels of education have been going up, seems to kind of vindicate the status quo or the establishment. And that is deeply uncomfortable to the school of thought that says that the entire establishment is corrupt and rapacious.
And for fear of sounding like a thrill seeker, it's also not that exciting.
It is less exciting. The fact that 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday just doesn't get the blood pumping, but it ought to. These are human lives. And it is not the point isn't to just convey good news. The point is to convey complete news, to give people a picture of what is happening in the world that isn't driven by something that exploded this morning.
Is your biggest enemy in trying to prove your point memory, or rather the lack of it? We don't remember how miserable things were 30, 40 years ago.
Exactly right. Franklin Pierce Adams said that the best explanation for the good old days is a bad memory. Mm-hmm. And we do forget that More than half of Europe was under the control of dictatorships not so long ago, that people had to line up for gasoline, that there was double-digit inflation and unemployment in most Western countries, that Africa was in flames with civil wars all over the country. Southeast Asia had massive wars for years. Latin America under the control of military dictatorships with many countries in civil war. And this is not ancient history. You don't even have to go back 100 or 200 years. This is a history of the 70s and the 80s.
Are we to some extent the victims of our own success here? Precisely because life is generally speaking quite comfortable, because we're not being killed by diseases that would kill us 100 years ago or so, and we have forgotten, we've become victims of our own success, and therefore we can roll the dice with these dark scenarios.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. Partly it's a good thing. As we raise our standards, we can think that the world is getting worse, whereas in fact that our standards have become more inclusive. We care more about suffering that may have been off the radar screen a few years ago. We care about the bullying of children. We care about harassment of women in the workplace. And these are good things, as long as they don't obscure the progress that we've made so that we become cynical or fatalistic about the very possibility of improvement.
One of the amazing bits of progress that we all take for granted now is contained in a small handheld device, the supercomputer at our disposal that allows us to access facts at the touch of a screen. Isn't that also your problem? Is that for every set of facts that you present, your critics, your enemies will come up with their set of facts and say, this is what we have found out, this is what we believe, and we stick to our core beliefs here.
Well, if these are...
fake news, if you like.
That is a problem, and we are in a kind of period of anarchy and Wild West when it comes to information disseminated on the internet, which is what happened when the printing press started to make printed material widely available. There were conspiracy theories, there were apocryphal books of the Bible being circulated.
But how do you combat that today?
Well, we need to develop a new set of norms that are appropriate to the digital era. Maybe it will come from education in digital literacy, starting in elementary school. Don't believe everything that you read. Question the source, see what their standards of fact-checking are. Maybe it'll just take the rising up of a new set of norms as to what seems ridiculous, what seems laughable versus what seems trustworthy. We already are having institutions of truth verification that at the same time that there's fake news are quite remarkable. I mean, Wikipedia...
Institutes of truth verification, there's
Yes.
an Orwellian sounding term.
Not PolitiFact in the United States that holds politicians' feet to the fire in terms of fact-checking their assertions. Not Wikipedia, which is a massively collective effort, but which nonetheless has done a stupendous job at rooting out pseudoscience and conspiracy theories. Not Snopes.com, which debunks urban legends. So it can be done. The prestige and common acceptance of the respectable portals of verification and truth-seeking have to be elevated at the expense of the nonsense that circulates often on Facebook and social media.
So how do you persuade someone who believes that President Trump is the answer to America's problems, or Brexit to the problems of this country, with a lot of political and popular support? How do you persuade them if they're wrong?
The point of my book isn't to take a partisan side on the political debates of 2016 to 2018.
Well, you take a swipe at Steve Bannon, for instance.
Yes, well, Steve Bannon,
many people would argue was Trump's brain, or certainly part of Trump's brain.
That's right. Well, I do argue against his kind of Nietzschean view of inherent conflict and heroism of the nation as the ultimate good, that nations are pitted in zero-sum competition, and so international cooperation is just being a chump or declaring defeat, by noting that international institutions have a fantastic track record of preventing the recurrence of the wars that killed people by the tens of millions in the first half of the 20th century. They made the world richer, they made the world more democratic, they made the world more peaceful. So I certainly would argue against the Steve Bannons. I don't know if I would argue against millions of Trump voters.
I mean, the title is Enlightenment Now. Do you sense a real peril for the values that you hold dear? Well, in this particular moment?
They are certainly threatened by the rise of authoritarian nationalist populism, but they've also been
corroded. But they've been threatened before, haven't they?
They were, that's right.
1930s.
Quite right.
Yeah.
And they're also corroded from within the university by the denial of the existence of truth and objectivity within postmodernist schools of thought, the rise of religious fundamentalism that looks to scripture and ecclesiastical authority as a source of truth rather than reason and science. So it's not just the events of the last couple of years that led me to write the book.
But is it a human need to believe, whether it's in, I don't know, a concept, a story, a religious faith? Is it a human need to believe? And ultimately, that's always what the data rubs up against.
Well, it is, but we can counter certain human needs. We have self-control. We have reason. We can discount a number of our emotional responses, and we've done that in cases such as bringing the rate of violence down, where people don't automatically pull out a knife if they've been insulted. People don't sleep with anyone who is available. We can we can project into the future the consequences of our choices. Now, it's not easy. That always fights back. That ability to control our impulses and to appeal to reason fights back against intuition and instinct and impulse. But it's not a battle that we always lose, and often we've won it.
So just very briefly and finally, in a year's time, or maybe 5 years' time, are we going to be in a better place, and will we know it?
We will know it. I can't predict that we'll be in a better place. I'd be more confident 5 years out than 1 year out.
Steven Pinker, thank you very much.
Thank you.